Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Steve Lopez.
Hi, Richard Moorcroft. How are you? Very happy to see you and chat to you today.
Oh, look, very nice to see you again too. And your exhibition is Still and Still Moving at Mitchell Fine Art in Brisbane. Well, I know, Steve, that you have travelled very widely, not only within Australia, but also internationally. But you have said that these works for this exhibition are essentially Australian based. But is there a sense of regional identity to them?
Yes, they're based on a few areas where I've travelled to, which I sort of considered marginal areas for myself out in places down the south coast near Bungonia and Marulan, where I have a little bush block, and also up in Darwin. And I stayed up there last year for a couple of weeks and brought my son up, and we stayed in Rapid Creek out in the suburbs of Darwin. And I'm always looking for the oddness of the landscape and things that interest me. And I'm starting to become a little bit more urban in what I'm approaching. But also I've been there a few times up to Darwin. And so I would say probably the top end has been a really big influence. Most of them are sort of started there, but I sort of put in other elements, and some of them can be a bit universal, but they're based off most of my travels recently. And also my connections, and I have some friends up in Darwin who I talked to and found out about the history of the top end and sort of the unwritten folklore of the area, and sort of tried to recontextualize it to how me being a European-based background, or a person, from my family, and some of the stories of that interrelation between Europe and Australia. So it is localized, and it's based off a whole group of stories and friends and things that I've seen collected and people I've spoken to.
So as you collect all these things from the particular places, the particular objects, the particular people, how do you decide to assemble the players and the places in these works?
A lot of it, comes from my imagination, comes from the stories, narrative based, a lot from collage. So it is quite arbitrary, but you'll be surprised. Like when I'm up there, I might see, I was up in an area where Cyclone Tracy hit, Darwin, and there was still, some old houses that hadn't been refixed, and sort of areas which looked sort of dilapidated amongst some of the new. So I would see a place like that, and then I would come back to Sydney into my studio and place a figure amongst some of the backgrounds that I'd painted there in situ, or put a walking figure across something that just looked completely suburban, and all of a sudden it really energizes that actual picture.
So a little while ago you mentioned that you look for oddness sometimes. What do you mean by oddness? What is odd to you?
So sometimes I look for things like rust, texture, weird objects, things that maybe even be 150 years old, if miners detritus in the landscape, often just jumps out amongst the modern world. And that's also too with the way that people are in the landscape. Sometimes it might be the fact that someone's not wearing any shoes in the middle of a suburban marketplace. That looks odd. And it's a matter of picking it up and looking for that in those areas. A couple of years ago, I went up to Arnhem Land and to Kakadu and stayed with the Cannon Hill mob there. And all of a sudden, where they were showing us some of these the drawings in the caves and the markings, and that was just completely another world to me. But it's still at the same time they were saying, well, you paint the landscape, you're telling your stories just like we do. And I thought that was really lovely, the connection that we have. It's their land, and we're sort of, as white or Western people come in, we still live here too, so we can share these experiences and still have our own stories and our own viewpoints. And to me, it looked alien to me, but at the same time, very comforting. And I thought, well, I can create my own stories as an artist. I interpret the world that I'm in, and that's my job, is to make things interesting. So I'm always looking for something that just doesn't make sense and can add a little bit of vitality to an image, just instead of a normal picture. Something that has a little bit of poison in it that keeps you looking and makes the work grow over time.
Let's go to a particular work now, Inside the Outpost. And you mentioned earlier the damage and destruction from the cyclone to Darwin. That seems to be incorporated in this work.
I went to Darwin and sort of looked at some of the images in the museum of the devastation that hit that small sort of isolated outpost to me, which I sort of considered, you know, the history of it, which was built by Chinese people, you know, who came to that area because it was harsh conditions, and then they built this little city in the heat in that rough outpost. You know, as I would term it, compared from the cities you know, on the East Coast where I'm from, and also coming from Europe. Italian background, and I just spent time over on the Western Front and up in Belgium and France, and I looked at some of the old photos of the revolution, the Paris Revolution. And if you have a look in that image, some of it's actually some Parisian terraces which had been bombed. And it's an imagined world, but two, it's quite familiar to me. And it's like these people who are in that picture have been devastated and trying to rebuild. So there's also some hope in there as well. There's a fellow there in the foreground sitting down, thinking about, okay, now where do we go from here and how do we rebuild? And two women in the background, almost as mother figures, mother and child, almost, you know, we've got to settle and rework it. And these stories that I heard about Europeans coming to the north of Australia, the Dutch, the Portuguese, there was these interrelations too with the Indigenous community from the Macassans who came over to, you know, trade. And they're written in the history books, and some encounters aren't written in history books. So, you know, they're all creating stories, and we've got these histories in our own country which need to be explored, and I'm trying to reimagine them in my way.
Sometimes you seem to create groups of quite ordinary figures, but you seem to imply some sort of common purpose or conspiracy. And I'm thinking about the work Uncommon Figures.
There's a location to that work. It's actually Nightcliff in Darwin. And I'm sort of imagining what would it be like to be a European person coming to this strange land and having to start from scratch. And you can see there's a little pier that they've built, but also too in the foreground, there's some images of some bones. They're actually branches, but you'll see on a little stump some images of some skulls and stuff. And that's borrowed, and I got permission, you know, from my dealer up in Brisbane who's got some work from Arnhem Land, of the bones that the Europeans took back to Europe, of the indigenous people, almost as museum pieces. And so it's almost what, you know, an interpretation of what were these people thinking when they came here and tried to create a world, but also didn't really respect that land at that time. And so I'm sort of trying to put myself into that position. How would I be? And that's why the people are looking ordinary. They might have flannelette shirts. They might have, you know, trousers which we're wearing now. And we're all human. We all have the same sort of feeling, you know, whether we're our ancestors or we're in the now. And I think that I'm trying to get into a human sort of spirit in the paintings, more so than trying to say a narrative. So it's about feeling for me too, and an emotion, and putting myself into that position and imagining it can create something that's interesting.
There do also seem to be times when you are simply observing your surroundings and the elements in it with a very careful eye, but also with affection. I'm thinking of a work like The Back Garden. Are you seeing those objects with affection, but not necessarily judgment?
Yeah, there's an element to some of my paintings where I'm just really attracted to the landscape or to the image and want to paint it. And you need to have that love for the subject, because that's what keeps you interested in the work for a long time. You know, it might take me a few months to get a work done, and I want to create that interest and have that connection to the work. And so something like that was a suburban backyard, and I saw this beautiful tree, you know, cherry tree in there with these back sheds. And if you have a look in the image, you'll see a little figure just popping its head out to the side. And that's an imagined figure, almost like a Beckman face. I love Max Beckman, and that was inspired from that. Just putting something in there that just looked odd or out of the ordinary. But it is generally just a beautiful image, but it's of something that's very ordinary. And there's a lot of beauty in the ordinary. And that's what I sort of tend to look for, I think, in the way that I approach my work.
You mentioned earlier that, you know, that often you're creating or implying some sort of narrative in the work, and occasionally the title and the image activities just beg for some form of explanation. I'm thinking of Best Offer. Give us a sense of what's going on here and how you want people to read it.
Okay, now that was inspired from my stay up in Darwin in Rapid Creek, and there's the famous Rapid Creek markets there, which is a mix of different communities, different foods, people. You've got Chinese people with their markets and the fruit and food. And then you've got Indigenous people there. You've got Indonesians, people from Darwin. And it was just a wonderful sort of old little marketplace and arcade, which reminded me of the 70s back, when I was growing up and, being in an Italian family and migrant family, going to the markets. And there was this real communal feel and mix of people, which I think is a really good example of Australia now, I feel, as a cultural mix and where we should be growing from, and we are, which is great. And to me, I was trying to create a little marketplace, and you can see that there's some writing up on the wall. There's a Chinese rug. There's an alphabet, and that alphabet was I saw in one of those caves, the Indigenous caves, the Cannon Hill Mob at Hawk's Nest in Kakadu, and that was them trying to understand the English language from about 100 years ago. They were writing the alphabet up on the walls. And so I wanted to put that into the landscape. I wanted to talk about that confluence of different ideas and mix, which I seem to think Darwin does have. You can be there in a bus with different people all sort of sitting together, and it's nothing special. You've got different Aboriginal languages and different people from different tribes speaking together. You've got Chinese people, students, people, Darwinites, suburban people in the middle of this lovely heat. And it's just part of life. Whereas here we can be a little bit politicized in the cities where I'm from, and it can be a really sort of, you can stay in your own little sort of mix of people out in the suburbs or in the inner city or in the cooler parts of town. Whereas there, I think it's very all together, and that's what those markets symbolize for me. And Best Offer is an idea of a marketplace that's selling ideas, and that young girl in the foreground to me is open to these ideas, and that's why I chose someone who looks a bit innocent and sort of this weird sort of connection of people in the background.
Let's move away for a moment from the narrative content of the paintings towards actually your relationship with paint and approach to painting. Sometimes it seems really quite precisely descriptive in something like Tooth and Nail, for example. And sometimes there's very loosely evocative paint, as there is in Exotic Gardens and Barefoot Figure, Darwin. Give us a sense of how you approach paint.
Well, I approach it just from 2 points of view: plein air painting and studio work. And my studio work tends to be very constructed, so it can be a bit tighter, but it's very much informed by my plein air painting when I'm outdoors. It can be a lot looser. I'm sort of inspired by the colours out there that I see that I can't invent back at home. The mark making and just being out in the elements forces you to think quick and to work quick. And from that, you can learn quite a lot in your normal practice. Sometimes I found when I was just working in the studio for years at home that it could become quite contrived. And it comes from making a lot of bad pictures, to get good. You learn what actually works and what doesn't. So I tend to combine the two in my best work. When I'm working well, I find that there's a level of control, but also looseness. And that's, I think, that works best for me.
You've mentioned some of the social or cultural convictions which seem to motivate many of the works that you create. And in one work called Toy Soldier, there do seem to be some very specific historic symbols.
Well, that one's more like a dream sort of scape painting, but it was based all in fact. When I went to the Western Front and we went to a museum in Peron, there was these little maquettes of they're like almost little toys, but it was of world domination. These were ships. You'll see this picture, that painting. There's these merchant ships and warships, and there's a little maquette of Africa fights in Africa between the local people and the Europeans. And these strange sort of toys I thought were really fascinating, because it also talks about in the north, people trying to find Australia and to, almost in an imperial sort of advance to take it over. There was the Dutch and the Portuguese, who actually had African slaves in the bottom of their ships, and they found African coins and elements of that trading that happened to the north of Darwin and into north of the top end. And so these are all parts of our history too, that shipping coming across and making touch with the landscape and our borders. The French who came. And so to me, that was still very Australian based. It's that idea of taking over, colonizing a nation. And then you've got the person falling asleep And sometimes I hope that we haven't forgotten about history, and maybe that's what the painting is about. Someone is he asleep, or is he dreaming of a past, or are we dreaming of a future? So it's quite open-ended, that image.
A work with cultural intersections, I guess, which you've been talking about frequently during this interview. The Dutch bottle and Macassan, um, which seems to bring so many elements, physical and human, together. Tell us what you see here.
Well, that's inspired from my good friend Frank Goya, who lives in Darwin, and he told me a lot of the stories and introduced me to a lot of the areas in the suburbs in Darwin. And I stayed near him, and I'd go over there and have some barbecued sausages, some whiskey and chocolate at midnight over there in the hot after, in the hot time there in the middle of our winter, which was still 30 degrees, which I loved it. And he was telling me the stories of these gin bottles that he'd go around to the mangroves and he found these old Dutch gin bottles, which were from, before Captain Cook supposedly came to Australia, so there's always been a contact. And these are tangible objects in his hand that he's found that aren't recorded in history books, but they're there. We're talking about African coins being found in Darwin. So there was obviously some trading and stuff that was happening even with Indigenous people. So that made those stories real. It wasn't just an imagination. And those sculptures in that picture, they're from the Macassan sculptures from Indonesia. And they were trading with the Aboriginal people 200s of years ago. There was drawings of their boats in the caves from, the 1500s. So, primitive boats. And I've got a couple of those boats in images in this exhibition coming up as well. And there was a big sculpture in the foreground, which is a sculpture that I own of a European toy of a big horse. It's a child's horse, which I think it's about 120 years old, which I've got at home. And so I was mixing these tribal elements, these tribal sculptures, with somebody who's a suburban person who lives there, who has all these histories. Yeah, I think that's what that story's about. It's almost like a homage to Frank and his ideas, and also Australia and that European sense of why we came out to Australia and what have we done, and that interconnection.
I'd like to conclude with a work which is a wonderful eclectic assembly of objects that you've brought together, Carpentaria Still Life. And again, they look as though they are objects that are very real, but also very much that you have visually assembled.
Yeah, they are. It's a still life of what I sort of call that colonial sort of imperialism, trying to take over the world. You'll see a big map and it's got the map of Australia just started to be mapped out, and Europe in the background. And then you'll see a little bust of the Kaiser, who, to me, he's sort of that trying to get Germany and all that back in the 1900s to be a big, huge world power caused a lot of, chaos. And we all know what happened after that. And so it's quite a confronting image, but it shows that imperialism and trying to take over people. And then the thing for me, you'll see a human form, which I saw in Paris when I was on my travels, of a body, that's almost like the muscles or the system of an anatomical sculpture. And that's humans who are the end result of all this domination. They end up suffering. Yeah, so it might look like a very calm painting, but it's about aggression and domination. And I think the crocodile symbolizes for me that aggression and that trying to take over other countries. Did they need to do that? And are we still trying to do that, on a world scale, which obviously it is happening. And we've got to learn from history in the past. So it's a small, quiet little still life, but I'm trying for it to say something more than what is initially there. And if you read into the actual subjects that I've chosen to portray, they're quite important for me. And it's also set in a European background of maybe a parlour or a lounge. And I actually saw that in the Rodin Museum in Paris. That's actually one of the rooms. And I thought, coming out of that European sort of idea of, luxury, charm, being comfortable, and trying to have these little ideas of, yes, I think I might take over this country, and then set out a whole army. It's where it all starts from that comfortable idea of home. And that's why I thought a still life for me, was the best way to sort of explain that instead of putting all figures and all these people in these sort of combinations. I tried to do something which for me is a bit different, and I really enjoy painting that work.
Well, powerful symbols and a powerful narrative in this and many of the other works. So, Steve Lopez, thanks very much for sharing your exhibition with us.
Thank you, Richard. Take care.